All right, welcome everyone to this Conflict Trends event. My name is Håkon Gjerløv and I'm the acting director here at the Peace Research Institute of Oslo. I'm very glad to see that so many has showed up for this morning event. In my bookshelf, one of the kind of formative books when I was a student was Steven Pinker's Better Angels of Our Nature, which I'm sure many here have heard about. And for those of you that have not, that is a book where Professor Steven Pinker talks about the decline of violence among humans. So the increased peaceful relations between groups, individuals, and nations. The evidence for that book has, of course, been debated up and down, back and forth. But one of Pinker's important, or at least one of the things he wanted us to learn from that book was to understand the successes. So what is it that we can learn from when we succeed? Today, I think we will talk more about failures. And as we now are about to be presented the numbers for conflict in 2025, and this event will ask the very pertinent question of why is all of this happening? I think it's very important that we try to think, okay, so what can we learn from those successes and what can we learn from our more recent failures? To do this, to show us the numbers, we have the Uppsala conflict program, and Therese Pettersson will do this, will present these for us today. And we present this through what we call the Conflict Trends Report, which is the sixth, and it's an annual report, and this is the sixth in the series, if I'm not mistaken. And this gives us an annual chance to discuss these very large and extremely important questions for, if I want to be, for our species. And the numbers, they give us a systematic overview. This is an extremely chaotic world. The world of peace and conflict is extremely chaotic. And having the systematic numbers to understand the trends, to understand the global picture, is extremely important for us to also develop policies, actions to counter those trends and to bring us back into the successful stories. I want to thank Siri Aas-Rustad for organizing the event here today. After Therese Pettersson from the Uppsala conflict program has presented us with the numbers, we will have a panel discussion with both Siri and Therese, but also with Simon Reed Henry, who is a research professor here at PRIO, and Trygve Augestad, head of section Development and Humanitarian Cooperation, section for Africa and Latin America, in the Norwegian People's Aid, here to tell us more about the success stories. And with that, welcome everyone to this event, and Therese, take it away.
All right, so good morning and thank you for inviting me. Yeah, there won't be that many success stories in my presentation today, unfortunately. Right now, at 9 o'clock, Oxford University Press has also promised to publish the Journal of Peace Research article. So for those of you who like conflict data, this is a good day. There is a lot to look at. I will focus primarily on the trends in 2025 and how that fits into the larger historical perspective. And there will be time for questions later. So we can go more into detail in methodology or definitions if you're interested in that. But I will just briefly mention, for those of you who need to refresh your memory, that UCDP are the world's leading provider of conflict data used by researchers, governments, international organizations, journalists, and many others. And we have been doing this for over 40 years, with data extending back to 1946 for conflicts involving states and 1989 for the other types of organized violence that we collect data on. And we have primarily three categories of violence. That's the core UCDP data. So state-based violence or state-based conflicts where the state is fighting another state, or more commonly where the state is being challenged by one or several rebel groups that either want to overthrow the government or control a piece of territory. We have the non-state conflicts where the state is not one of the primary warring parties, but where rebel groups are fighting each other, or drug cartels, organized crime groups, also less organized groups such as ethnic groups or religious groups. And the third category, one-sided violence targeting civilians, where civilians are the intended target of attacks. It can be large-scale things as massacres and genocide, but also executions of opposition politicians, for example. Most civilian fatalities are not registered in this third category, but instead in state-based conflict, when civilians are killed in crossfire or in the use of indiscriminate types of warfare, such as shelling or airstrikes targeting one of the warring parties. But the third category captures incidents where civilians are the intended target of an attack. And we also have a fourth category that we published data on in 2020, and we have continued to update it, but we haven't really published it as part of the core UCDP data. And this category is called violent political protests, or VPP. And we have focused a little bit on that in this year's article in JPR. So I will also introduce that a little bit. And this category was developed after the Arab Spring, where we saw that there was a lot of violence that didn't really fit into one of these three categories. But I will get back to that. For all categories, we have a threshold of intensity for a conflict to be considered active, 25 direct battle-related deaths during one calendar year. And all categories are also mutually exclusive, including the VPP category. All right, so 2025. This graph shows the three main categories of violence, and the gray area in the background, or almost pink, it looks on my screen here, is the total number. So you can see that 2025 is an exceptionally bloody year in conflict data. We can see that this increase is driven primarily by one-sided violence. And this is tied to events in Sudan and in Al-Fasher in Darfur specifically. I will get back to that later. The red line is state-based conflict, and we can see that for most years, the state-based conflicts drive this trend. For 3 years now, state-based violence or fatalities from state-based violence have been rather stable, but on a very high level. We had this peak in 2022 when we had two exceptionally deadly wars going on at the same time, the Russia-Ukraine war and the war in Tigray, Ethiopia. But after the end of the Tigray war, fatalities decreased quite sharply, but had sort of stabilized on a very high level. And you can see that state-based conflicts drive this trend, and the main exception is the Rwandan genocide in 1994. If we look at the longer trend, this graph combines UCDP data with the PRIO battle deaths data for the year before 1989. So this starts in 1946. And we used this graph for many years saying that, well, we have these huge wars of the 20th century, so we're nowhere near that now, although we see violence increasing. But the peak in 2022 was actually comparable to some of the years during the Vietnam War. And we can also see now that fatalities have increased. So we have this, it's not just one conflict creating a peak. We do have an increase in the number of fatalities. And this is just battle-related deaths, so state-based conflicts. So the Rwandan genocide, for example, is not included in this graph. This map shows the geographical distribution of violence in 2025. And although we do recognize or record violence in a lot of countries across the world, you can see that the size of the circles that reflects the number of fatalities in a certain location. So you can see that fatalities are concentrated to a few very deadly conflicts. the war in Ukraine, in Gaza, and you can see the red circle, which represents one-sided violence in Sudan, like I mentioned earlier. So we see this increase in violence, but it's a few, or relatively few, cases that are have the vast majority of fatalities in the world. We also see a lot of violence in the DRC, in Haiti, in Pakistan, from this map. So if we shift our attention to the number of conflict instead of the fatalities, another important trend becomes visible. In 2025, UCDP recorded 65 active state-based conflicts, and this is the highest number ever recorded by the UCDP. To put this into perspective, in 2010, we had 31 active conflicts. So the number of active conflict has more than doubled during the past 15 years. And this suggests that the increase in organized violence is not only about a few particularly deadly conflicts, but it reflects a world with a growing number of active conflicts. When the numbers started to increase in 2011, it was largely a consequence of IS spreading across the world. So IS entered into new countries, challenged new governments, and thereby created new conflicts. But the share of IS conflicts has decreased. That's not the pattern that we see now. Instead, we see a nearly global escalation of violence. There are new conflicts, restarted conflicts, and it's a mix of different types of conflict. So we cannot explain it with one phenomenon, such as the IS spread across the world. One of the most striking findings in this year's report is that interstate conflicts have increased dramatically. So conflicts between states doubled for the second year in a row, from 2 interstate conflicts in 2023 to 4 in 2024 and to 8 in 2025. And 8 interstate conflicts is the highest number ever recorded by the UCDP, so since the start of the data collection in 1946. For many years, interstate conflicts were relatively rare, and today we see a different pattern, and this trend suggests growing tensions between states, an increased willingness to use military force across international borders. And these conflicts carry the potential of becoming much more deadly than intra-state conflicts. So this is a really worrying trend. Most conflicts remain relatively small. Of these 65 conflicts, 13 passed the threshold of war, which is 1,000 battle-related deaths during a calendar year. So in 2025, 13 of these conflicts reached that level. This is an increase from 11 the year before, and we need to go back to 1992 to find a year with more wars than 2025. So we're not only seeing more conflicts, but we also see more highly intense conflicts in the world. To summarize, state-based conflicts, so we had 65 active conflicts, the highest number ever recorded. Of those, 8 were interstate conflicts, again, the highest number ever recorded by the UCDP. If we only look at state-based fatalities, they decreased marginally, but it's a similar level. It's been like that for 3 years now. And the number of wars increased from 11 to 13, and we saw a lot of escalation in Iran, Pakistan, DRC, and Sudan, also in Haiti. And violence de-escalated in Gaza and Lebanon, but we all know that the situation in Gaza remains fragile, and in Lebanon we have seen escalation again this year. So this is just a reflection that the violence decreased in 2025 compared to 2024, and that was after signing ceasefires in both these cases. So turning to one-sided violence, one of the most dramatic developments during 2025 concerns one-sided violence against civilians. We recorded around 76,500 civilian fatalities in this type of violence in 2025. And this is an increase of almost 440% compared to the year before. And as I mentioned earlier, this is driven by Sudan, and it's the highest level recorded since the Rwandan genocide in 1994. You can see that this graph shows the regional distribution, and Africa is driving this trend for most years, and obviously also in 2025. So Sudan is the single most important case for understanding one-sided violence in 2025. Since the outbreak of the civil war in 2023, civilians have repeatedly been targeted by both sides. So we've had a lot of one-sided violence in this conflict for several years. But the events surrounding El Fasher during 25 stands out even in the historical perspective. So following the fall of the city in October, reports emerged of large-scale massacres being executed by RSF. And the access to this area remains limited. It's very hard to verify report, but the available evidence suggests that tens of thousands of civilians have been killed. And these events are the main reason why we see this development in one-sided violence. We did also see an increase in one-sided violence carried out by state actors, and examples from 2025 include Syria and Tanzania. In Syria, the new government has had a hard time controlling the ethnic tensions after the fall of the Assad regime, and we've seen executions of civilians in the coastal areas and in the south, in Sueda. And in Tanzania, following the October 25 elections, we recorded a violent crackdown on protesters by the government, which resulted in more than 1,000 deaths in the one-sided violence category and also several hundreds of fatalities in the VPP category, the violent political protests. So it's time for the happy news in this presentation. Non-state violence actually decreased in 2025. So we registered 14,500 deaths, which is the lowest level since 2013. And this is because violence continued to decrease in the Americas. The Americas have been driving this trend for many years, and a reduction of violence in Mexico and Brazil. But Mexico is still very hard hit by this type of violence and accounted for more than half of all the fatalities in non-state violence in 2025. This graph shows the blue line here is the Americas, so you can see this clear decrease from the peak in 2021. And the Middle East, the yellow one, also had a lot of non-state violence before 2017. And that was the inter-rebel fighting connected to the civil war in Syria. The war between Russia and Ukraine remained by far the deadliest conflict in the world in 2025, with almost 95,000 fatalities, battle-related deaths. They accounted for roughly 62% of the battle-related deaths registered globally. And this number is also likely to be revised upwards because there is a reporting delay when it comes to combatant fatalities. The wars in Gaza and Sudan were the next deadliest conflicts, and if we combine like the one-sided violence connected to the conflicts, Sudan would obviously pass Gaza in this list. So together, these three wars account for a large share of the global burden of violence during 2025. But this list is almost similar as last year and the year before that. So violence remains concentrated to pretty much the same conflicts. So this year we also present updated data on violent political protests. So these are situations where protesters and state authorities use armed violence against each other, but where the protest movement is not organized enough to be registered in the state-based conflict category. So they don't have a name, they don't have a leadership and a clear structure, command structure. So it's more people in the streets or in a square, but that call for regime change or for independence. So they state an incompatibility in UCDP lingo. And in 2025, examples include Tanzania and Iran. So this category helps us capture forms of violence that fall between state-based conflicts and violence against civilians. So a lot of protest violence is also obviously one-sided violence, where states kill unarmed civilians, protesters. But when the protesters also use violence against the state, that has been a form of violence that we haven't been able to capture. So this category was added after the Arab Spring, as I said, because we did see a lot of violence taking place in that category. And the peaks in 2011 and 2013, driven by cases connected to that, Egypt. But we have seen this type of violence in many countries. And in recent years, we've had a lot of these Gen Z protests, for example, in Bangladesh, Iran, several cases. And this map shows that even though fatalities are concentrated to the Middle East, this is a global phenomenon. So we do have VPPs registered in several countries in the world. And the same cutoff here as in the other categories. These are dyads that result in at least 25 direct deaths during 1 year. And the data extend back to 2011 so far. So what we've done this year is, it used to be a dyad year data set, but now we have event coded it from 2011. And hopefully we will be able to do that to 89, and it can be included maybe in the UCDP georeferenced events dataset, but for now it's from 2011 onwards. And like I said, the reason for adding this is that we want to capture a more complete picture of what's going on so that we're not missing one piece of the puzzle. What we see in the data is that there are often several categories of violence going on at the same time in the same place. So we do have cases where we have state-based conflict, one-sided violence against civilians, and VPPs going on at the same time. And it's important to separate them to be able to study the different dynamics, but also to be able to look at the whole, the full picture. A sneak peek of 2026 data. This is based on the UCDP candidate events, which is a bit more preliminary. I don't know if it's a bit hard to see with the green color there. I'm sorry about that. But we recognize the picture. Violence remains concentrated to basically the same areas. What we do see is a lot of violence in Iran. This is both the protests in the beginning of the year with a lot of violence against civilians and violent political protests, and then obviously also the attacks carried out by the US and Israel and all the violence in the region that followed. So this shows data for the first 4 months of 2026, and we registered almost 80,000 deaths in the UCDP candidate data for the first 4 months of the year. Last year, we had registered 38,000 fatalities for the first 4 months of the year. So this suggests an increase in violence this year. It's not very surprising, given what we see happening every day now. But there's also a lot of this year left, right? So we don't know what this will look like next year when I stand here presenting the data. But it's definitely a worrying development in the world at the moment. All right, I will stop there. Thank you.
Now I would like Trygve and Simon and Therese to join me in the panel, and we'll have a discussion about the data. Okay, so thank you, Teresa. It's always exciting for peace researchers and conflict researchers when we get the new data. But it's even more exciting to try to dig deep into them and try to figure out what is the trends that we're looking at and how can we understand what's going on. So I'm really happy to have the three of you to help me do that. And as Håkon already said, it's Simon Reed-Henry, who is a research professor here at PRIO. Trygve Augestad, who's the head of Section of Development and Humanitarian Cooperation, the section for Africa and Latin America, Norwegian People's Aid. And then Teresa, who you just heard. So I'm going to start off with asking some questions about Sudan, which is obviously the sort of big conflict this year and the shocking news this year. As Teresa just said, it's recorded more than 75,000 killed this or in 2025. These numbers are higher than the UN has reported, and it's also higher than ACLED, who is our competitor. So I want to start with you, Teresa. Can you say a little bit about how UCDP is actually coding this, and why do we see this difference between the data?
Well, there is always uncertainty in conflict data, but after reviewing the evidence available, we concluded that the scale of violence was significantly higher than what other figures suggest. And historically, the problem has often been underestimation rather than overestimation, especially in inaccessible conflicts and high-intensity conflicts. So we settled on our best estimate after consulting the Jail Humanitarian Research Lab. So we had discussions with them and combined with other sources, obviously, from human rights organizations. But they based their estimates on satellite imagery and reports from individuals on the ground, testimonies from survivors, etc. And based on that, we felt we couldn't use a lower number because that would also not reflect reality very well.
Thank you. Trygve, Norwegian People's Aid is on the ground in Sudan. Do you feel that the numbers that are presented reflect what's going on? Are they too high? Are they too low?
Thank you. Thank you for a good report also. I think it's very hard for us to say because of the very fragmented situation and sort of how the war is going in Sudan. It's very hard for us to get access, especially to the areas in Darfur. Of course, for us, both we've been supporting groups both inside the El Fasher, also in Tawila. And of course, the number of refugees coming from Al Fasher is also giving you an indication of what has happened there. But of course, the complete blockout of communication, basically that the health facilities has been sort of bombed and taken out, also maybe illustrate that this number might be, like you said, maybe even higher than what you have said. I see that UNOCHA is saying that maybe 6,000 people were killed the first 3 days in El Fasher, but probably also that is very low. So, but it's hard to say. It's hard to get proper information, also because of the how can you say that the politicization of documentation of violence against human rights, etc. One of the warring parties would have an interest to say that, of course, it's high facilities on their side, very low on the other side, and the other way around when it comes to the RSF.
Thank you. Yeah, that's quite a common problem, I guess, that actors have interest in the numbers as well. But the situation in Sudan is quite complex. Could you say a little bit about what's going on for those of us who do not know the conflict that well?
It was introduced this meeting with, I mean, how many successes did we had in 2025? I mean, if we were invited here 6-7 years ago, we probably have been talking about Sudan as a success country. Then it was just a people's revolution led by neighborhood committees trade unions, etc., that managed to kick out the long-term serving dictator Umar al-Bashir. But of course, the taste of liberty, the taste of freedom was only for maybe 2 years before it was a military coup by the two warring parties, first together, and then the war broke out in 2023, and we have seen since more and more fighting, more and more unpredictable fighting because of the use of drones. It's very hard for the two warring parties to hold the areas because of drones. It's basically a country divided into two, with the RSF, the previous John Vagin in the west, and then you have SAF, the previous Sudan Armed Forces, on the Red Sea side. The big battle today is happening more in the south, towards South Sudan, in the South Kordofan areas, maybe in the Nuba Mountains, closer to that. We also see a split-off of the SPLM, which has been sort of the one, in de facto, the local authority in those areas. One of the SPLM wings have joined RSF, the other one has joined SAF, and you have even one in the middle, basically fighting for a more united Sudan again, together with South Sudan, because this, of course, also have a big spillover. And it's very hard to see any sort of solution anytime soon. The warring parties are trying everything they can to exclude the civilian forces, the civilian sort of that won the revolution back in 2019. They are being sidelined. We, for example, saw it on the Berlin conference recently, where SAF used most energy to criticize the democratic forces rather than actually attacking the RSF. So in a way, you see they have a sort of a joint interest of having this war going on, and I think both of them think they can win on the battlefield.
The way you describe it now, it's an internal struggles, a civil war. But when I talk to people from Sudan, they also say that this is a proxy war. So there are other states involved, for example, Yemen, Egypt, UAE, or Saudi Arabia, supporting different parties. Can you say a little bit about the international interests in Sudan and how that actually shapes the conflict?
I think you can say it started as an internal power struggle, the Sudan conflict, even though, of course, the region and the regional countries, also the Arabic countries, also always had an interest in what was happening in Sudan. But as the war have sort of moved on, the regional dynamics and the countries in the Arabic Peninsula has becoming more and more important. The Emirates, close to RSF, probably providing weapons and a lot of support to the RSF, probably getting gold and other natural resources in return. Egypt, connected to the SAF, the same with the Saudis. A lot of people say that you also need to basically look at the access to the Red Sea as one of the driving factors behind the war. And maybe that has been even more evident now when you see what's happening in the Persian Gulf and the closure of the Hormuz Strait. They are sort of investing more in the Sudan war. And then, of course, you also have the situation in Ethiopia. Egypt want to do everything they can to be a spoiler in Ethiopia. The same does Eritrea. So in a way, they have chosen in a way to sideline with the SAF to sort of facilitate that. How can we say all these problems for Ethiopia? While Ethiopia has also, I mean, we've seen on satellite images been sort of supporting RSF. We've seen training camps. Even the president went to apologize for some of the drone bombing that happened in Khartoum I think a month ago. Whether that is linked to American pressure to try to sort of cool down the situation. We see that they have lifted some sanctions on Eritrea, so it's becoming increasingly a regional war and maybe a proxy war, and the risk for spillover to neighboring countries, to Ethiopia. So the conflict in Amara, for example, was on your number 5, and of course it's a huge concern that becomes even worse, with Eritrea supporting a militia called Fano inside Amara. So that the regional dimension in Sudan might also spill over to the other countries, like in South Sudan, which is extremely fragile for the time being. And we know that sort of both parties in South Sudan is also having connection both with the RSF and with SAF, etc. So absolutely, regional.
Thank you. So this idea of proxy war, this is something, it seems like it's becoming more and more common. I mean, we see it in Yemen, Ukraine before the invasion, in the eastern parts, in Libya and Rwanda. So Simon, this kind of resembles what happens during the Cold War when you have two superpowers supporting the various conflicts. Would you say that we're moving towards a more polarized world again in terms of conflicts?
Yeah, thanks, Siri, and thanks also for this year's edition of the data. I mean, it's incredible when you see the numbers, and then also now we're beginning to get into some of the structural factors behind those numbers, which opens up for a lot of questions, Siri, as you're saying, on where this is taking us. And on one level, with the sort of historians look back, proxy wars are kind of one of the oldest tricks in the book. This is what states have been doing since Sparta. And of course, the Cold War is particularly associated with it because you had then a whole series of regional conflicts which were managed between and across the two superpowers, everywhere from Korea to Angola. But the great difference, I think, between that set of proxy conflicts and what we're seeing today, at least it sort of seems to me, is that was managed in a very tight, bipolar way. It was, as it were, enshrined within a larger context of nuclearization, which actually was the reason why those two powers went to proxy conflicts in the first place, because it was precisely a way of avoiding it. And when China, actually in the context of the Korean conflict, became a nuclear power, its immediate response was to stop engaging in the conflict there. So there's almost a sort of counter element to nuclearization as a cause of conflict there. But what we're seeing today, I think, is really different. We're seeing actually a fragmentation of proxy conflicts. So somewhere like Yemen, we were just mentioning a second ago, there you have Saudi Arabia on one side, you have Iran on the other. So you have a variety of competing mid-level powers which are engaging in proxy conflicts. That makes the whole situation more fraught. It makes the risks of spillover, Trygve, as you were into, much more likely, much more dangerous and harder to predict. And while we can be quite certain about the numbers that we're seeing now, Teresa, you were already into the fact that here, 4 months into 2026, we're looking at potentially much higher numbers next year. So for me, the question, Siri, is partly, what are the drivers of that complexity that we see within the numbers? So it's what the numbers aren't telling us in a sense. And I think, there we've got a number of issues which, scholars here at PRIO are all into in different contexts. Growing risk of fracturing of accountability lines. If you have a conflict with proxy powers involved in, as was the case in Syria, for example, and you have Syrian forces relying on both a combination of Russian, pro-Syrian government and Iranian forces, all as part of the same kill chain, it becomes very hard for standard norms like international law and warfare to be actually, guaranteed to be in place in those different contexts. So everything that we spent the post-Cold War era building up, the success stories, as it were, institutionally, is actually now in danger of being pulled back because we have a situation on the ground that no longer complies with that institutional reality that we built up. And I think that's actually one of the biggest dangers that we're seeing now in this kind of proxy conflict.
Thank you. Another trend that we're seeing as well, and which Teresa highlighted, is the increase of international conflicts, so conflicts between states. 8 in 2025, highest since 1946, and also in 2026, we see this continuing. Simon, what do you think this trend indicates?
Well, I think, Trygve, you were into this as well. The growing regionalization of what begin as intrastate conflicts, the spillover to then become regional cross-border conflicts. I think that becomes a big part of it. I think also what we're seeing is a breakdown in the larger multilateral order where there is a declining respect for international norms, for diplomatic solutions. And I think when the bar is lowered upon what it takes to engage in conflict, so it's the knock-on effect, if you will, of some of these same intrastate dynamics, then I think you see a growing willingness and sometimes also a necessity to turn to force to defend what are deemed to be vital interests. And here there's a separate economic element that feeds into this. You were mentioning access to the Red Sea and trade lines. And I think this is a key part too. We are in a fragmented economic international order as well. And that is changing the calculations that states, including even the existing hegemon, the US, are making with respect to how they manage, how they oversee, and in cases like we're seeing now in Iran, how they actually engage in international conflict. And that, for me, underscores, I think, one of the deeper drivers of the uptick in the trend line that we're seeing. And that is we are moving, broadly speaking, but messily, from a highly unipolar world that we had after 1989 to one that is much more multipolar. But we're doing so not in a managed way. We're doing so in a chaotic way in which that hegemon itself is engaging in some of the conflicts that are emerging around the edges of the former system. So that, for me, it's a geopolitical argument, but it's also a geoeconomic argument. Is really challenging the facts on the ground. It's making them much more complex.
So, as the world grows more violent and there's more global tension, there's more rivalry, also insecurity, I think. What is the role of multilateralism in this? What will the UN do? What can they do?
Yeah, it's not a very good role in the minute, is it? But actually, seriously, there's lots they can do. I mean, I mentioned some of the things they're not doing, which is the ability to uphold the rule of law, the laws and norms of war. That's partly an issue of the UN Security Council. We all know that has various challenges. But as I mentioned a second ago, it particularly has challenges when it's the hegemons themselves, the P5, that are engaged in these conflicts, because that's what causes the paralysis. And that's what makes it much harder to action the juridical framework where, organizations on the ground, but also, military peacekeeping, the AU and what it can do in these cases, it's constrained by what the larger multilateral system is able to deliver at the level of norms and core institutional commitments to an organized state of management of conflict. So that's one problem. I think also we were saying, there are these challenges of the decline of diplomatic norms. We're seeing that as a general drawdown, very hard to measure, but I think it's definitely a part of the culture of international politics that is something we're grappling with now. We're seeing definitely an increasing rivalrousness, I should say, between varieties of northern powers in particular that are needing to access, you were mentioning gold, critical mineral resources in many of these conflict zones. That creates vital interest challenges and, absolute conflicts of interest within those own government's position. Are they a peacekeeping force, or do they have an economic interest in the conflict on the ground? And I was minded when Teresa, when you put up your map towards the end there, it struck me there was a map that some of us drew a long time ago where we put those same conflicts in that same band around the world, but then we set them against the location of the 50 highest cities ranked according to Quality of Life Index, and they were all in very different places. And then we also put on the map increases in border technology and militarized security technology managing different border regions. And that was a pretty solid black line between all those different conflict regions. And I say this because it demonstrates that what is happening in these conflict areas is increasingly related to what is happening also in other parts of the world. And that's where, for me, the multilateral system comes in most strongly. It means that these figures are not simply stuff we need to observe. It's things that actually we need to be arguing for in a whole variety of what seem to be initially very distant areas, but where the institutional norms and practices we uphold are critical to managing these numbers.
Thank you. So Trygve, you said that the work you're doing in Sudan is really hard. So how does this development that Simon just have described affect the work that Norwegian People's Aid do?
Maybe let me just start with a short story, maybe from El Fasher and the Saudi hospital in El Fasher. The doctors there came together and started something they called the Doctors Initiative, because they didn't get any food to either the doctors and the nurses working there, but not to the patients either. So we started with a small grant. I think it was $5,000 a month that basically went to food for patients and for the people working there. And we continued to do that all the way up to October. And then it suddenly was radio silence from everybody. We were not able to get in touch with anybody. 2 weeks back, one of the doctors passed by our office in Nairobi to explain how he managed to get out of El Fasher. He used 3 months to get out of there. He was in hiding. He was struggling a lot with getting proper identification papers to be able to pass all those different sort of roadblocks. And for everybody, if somebody has been in Sudan since the war, to travel around in Sudan is almost impossible because of all these road stops. It's almost like going to the West Bank, I guess. It's so all these, how can you say, these administrative impediments and the lack of communication make this a very difficult area for us as a humanitarian organization to be able to respond. Fortunately for us, we came to Sudan to support all these local neighborhood committees, etc., that were interlinked into the revolution that happened in 2019. I'm wearing a T-shirt today now, says Sudan cannot wait, which is also a picture of this Nafir, which is also what we in Norwegian say almost like dugnad in Norwegian. So they already have a network of local responders, neighbors, community leaders, etc., that have been responded to humanitarian crises in those communities for thousands of years, actually. So we have sort of built on that sort of legacy in Sudan and worked with, many of you have probably heard about emergency response rooms that won the RAFTO prize last year, but you also, in addition to them, have several mutual aid groups and so on. So this is actually sort of instructing us in a way as an international organization that this is now we need to put this locally led response into proper action, because none of these international NGOs would have access to some of these areas we are talking about. So we are completely dependent on finding a way of providing funds and support to these local groups. And of course, that also leads that we need to change a little bit on how we think about accountability, for example. Instead of having this virtual accountability towards us as donors, we need to maybe start to think about horizontal accountability. That when you provide funds to our local groups, it's better that they maybe show for their community what they have been able to deliver, rather than actually write reports to us here in the north.
Thank you. No, I think Sudan has been a very good example of how the local can and is necessary to include. Okay, so I'm going to show a slide, which I'm sorry the three of you won't see. So this is it's a map of the international conflicts that we see in the world. So the state conflicts that we see, and I've tried to split them into groups. So we see some typical border conflicts. So India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Cambodia, Thailand. We also see some invasions, Ukraine, Russia being the most important one, but also Syria, Israel, Syria, where Israel invaded Syria. But then also we have this category, which I have named escalatory regional conflicts, and these are all in the Middle East. And we see an increase in tension in the Middle East. So a question for all of you. What do you think the potential for a large-scale conflict in the Middle East, and what is the potential consequences? And also, I want to add to that, listening to you, Trygve, have we been focusing too much on the Middle East? Are we facing a regional conflict in Africa as well? I don't know, Teresa, do you want to start?
Well, fortunately, my job is not to predict the future. But yeah, what stands out in the data is several interstate and intrastate conflicts being connected to the same broader regional security environment. And this, of course, creates a risk of escalation and spillover effects, like you mentioned, across the region. Conflicts becoming more interconnected, and escalation in one place can trigger escalation in others as well. And we see that in the data for 2025. So a lot of these conflicts being connected to Israel and what's going on in the region. But I will leave it up to others to predict if we're seeing a large-scale war in the region in the future.
Yeah, it's difficult for me to predict that as well, of course. But and of course, it's also about this with having so many crises at the same time. It's difficult to sort of get through the to get attention. I mean, just having Ukraine war, the crisis in Palestine, now Iran, and what is happening in Sudan, all of this at the same time. It's of course very difficult to get through the papers, through the media, and to talk about the situation. Of course, we have been pushing very hard for Norway, for example, to engage on the Horn because of our history. We think that is an area where Norway and NMFA is also prioritized to sort of follow the situation in Horn very closely. And that is where we potentially could have an added value with us being so close to what happened in South Sudan. All these different Norwegian NGOs that had a huge presence there for almost 50 years. But to the question on whether the situation in the Horn of Africa, taking what is happening in Sudan, now it's 25 million people in humanitarian need. The country is almost split into two. You see South Sudan, where basically the vice president is in jail, and nobody has access to Salva Kiir, hardly, which is the president. They are supposed to have an election this year. Will that happen? Or will we again go to another civil war in South Sudan? Ethiopia, three conflicts at the same time. We see the Tigrayans again are lining up with the Eritreans. The Eritreans even had meetings with both Fano, Ethiopia, Tigrayans, and also Sudan, sort of militia, SAF, inside Sudan. Are they building a coalition? So what will all this mean for the situation in the Horn of Africa? Of course, we are afraid and concerned that this terrible situation we have in Sudan will spread to the neighboring countries. And maybe the worst possible can happen if Ethiopia joins it.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly don't want to predict things with others in the room that know far more about this region than I do. But one thing we could do is look back, you know, and if we look historically, I think there are maybe two things I'd say. One is a very real danger is not necessarily of spread, but of interconnection between what once are disparate conflicts and what become a more uniform, generalized state of conflict that can happen. I mean, you look at even just at the start of the Second World War, we think that's very much a European story, but of course it's not. You have to understand what's happening in Manchuria. You have to understand what's happening also as the legacy of the previous conflict from the First World War. So there is a danger, as I see it, of a state of conflict becoming something that drags all parties closer to conflict, and that can then crop up in a variety of different places, and we see that perhaps in some of the disaggregation of this data. And then the second point I'd mention is to encourage us to ask, you know, what is it that puts people on the streets in the first place, streets metaphorically speaking, on the streets in the first place to rise up? And, you know, that's partly about regimes and local injustices and mistreatment of political power. But it's also about much larger injustices in terms of access to food, security in terms of supply lines. It's about ensuring that different countries and segments and ethnicities within those countries are equally treated under forms of international practice. So for me, and I thought this is where the VPP category becomes super interesting, right? Because it's sort of separated out from the larger data, but in many ways, that's where many of these stories begin. What is it that makes people get to the point where, whether it's for ethnic, whether it's for socioeconomic, whether it's for other sorts of reasons, they decide that conflict is the answer? And then we have two responses. One is we have better ways of preventing that answer being taken. But the other way is the preventive route, which for me is the better one. And it's the reasons why you guys are in these places in the first place, before conflicts emerge. And that is to find ways to avoid the need for those things. And again, that takes us back to the multilateral. It's about what sorts of rules and procedures we can institute that will reduce the risk of tensions becoming conflicts and escalating into wider wars. That's for me the big challenge.
Thank you. And I think if we add on top of this the decline in development aid that we see last year and continuing this year, we are facing a very challenging future. But we can leave that for a Q&A. But I want to continue talking a little bit about the Middle East. Because in the data, we see that Israel is involved in 5 conflicts, both internal and international conflicts. But Israel and Palestine and Gaza are very difficult issues to discuss when it comes to data. And I know, because I know the coding rules for the UCDP by heart, I know that this is coded as a civil war in the data. But I also know that that is something a lot of people will disagree with. It could be a colonial war, it could be a genocide, it could be an international war. And even some say that when data mislabel conflicts like that, that affects and undermining the fight for Palestine. How do you handle those kind of questions, Teresa?
Well, yeah, this is a question that we get a lot, and it's important to remember that UCDP's coding is not political. It's the categories, the coding decisions are analytical. We're not making a judgment or a statement about legitimacy or occupation. We're not considering international law. So we are applying a set of coding rules designed to make conflicts comparable across time and space. And to define a state is one of the first things you need to do if you're going to define a war as intrastate or interstate. And we use the Gladitchen word list of independent states, and Palestine is not defined as a sovereign state because of the lack of de facto territorial control. But I agree that Palestine is a borderline case, and it's something that we can discuss. But the important thing for the UCDP is that we apply these coding rules consistently and to make the data comparable. And the other part of that, when you mentioned genocide, the other problem, so to say, with this representing this conflict in the data is the fact that the civilian fatalities to a large extent is not recorded as one-sided violence against civilians, but as part of the state-based conflict, since Israel is consistently claiming that they're targeting Hamas operatives or other militant groups when they attack civilian areas. And that is just something that we need to explain over and over again, I guess, for people to understand how to operate this data. And I would think that if we do exclude them from the state-based conflicts, people would have opinion about that as well, if they would end up in the one-sided category, because then they sort of become invisible if you look only at state-based conflicts. So a bit like the Sudan war here, when we say that 12,000 people died in the Sudan conflict, that's not including the tens of thousands of civilians massacred in El Fasher, for example. So, yeah, we can just encourage our users to to read the code books. And
I'm sure they're super excited about that. But also following on something that I also find difficult even to explain, and that's the other internal conflict that is coded in Israel, which is the conflict between Israel and Hezbollah, which is the conflict that we now see in Lebanon. So this is a conflict that Israel is fighting Hezbollah, but all the fighting is happening in Lebanon. But this is still coded as an internal conflict in Israel. How do you deal with that?
Yes, so the origins of that coding is the stated incompatibility, which in this case is decades old. So the incompatibility stated by Hezbollah against Israel concerning the territory of southern Lebanon, which Israel also claimed. And this is a tricky case to explain. It's a very intricate situation, interconnected conflicts. But the important thing here is that the fighting is not between the government of Lebanon and Israel, although the fighting is taking place on Lebanese territory. Hezbollah is a difficult group to handle in the data because it's so state-like. It has a very strong presence in many areas and control a lot of territory and sort of they have a lot of a strong presence in society in Lebanon. So I realized that it's not very intuitive to see this as an internal conflict in Israel, but UCDP, like the incompatibility, is what defines the conflict here. And again, based on the coding rules, this is what we end up with, and then we can just do our best to explain that in our outputs and in places like this.
Thank you. I also get a lot of these questions, and my response is often that this is how it is coded and this is what I present, but we can disagree on definitions, and that makes really interesting discussions. So it's not possible to touch upon all conflicts that's in the data, and we talked about some of the bigger ones, but there are two conflicts or violent incidents I would like to highlight because they drown in everything else. Teresa has mentioned it, so you might picked up on it. The first is Haiti. Haiti is now defined as a war. It's more than 1,000 people killed in a civil war in Haiti. I don't think people know that. This started as gang violence due to state failure, lack of elections. Then these groups consolidated and fighting the interim government. And the other is Tanzania, which was mentioned that there is quite a lot of post-election violence, more than 1,000 people killed. And this is in a country that hasn't had conflict since 1946. This is the first time recorded this type of violence, as far as I know. So there is, and Teresa mentioned that several times, the increase of violence that we see in the world is not these larger, well-known conflicts. There are also other things going on. And I just wanted to get the panel's thoughts on these type of developments. Simon, do you want to start this time?
Yeah, thanks, Siri. So I mean, and I think in many ways Tanzania is more worrying because of the precedent that has been a very positive one, and Tanzania is often seen as a country that's very, that's well functioning and also that has a meaningful voice in broader regional and international affairs. Haiti is interesting because it reminds us that there are different background contexts to many of these conflicts. And you mentioned the escalation from a situation of state failure and B, gang warfare that has its own kind of history that takes us back to the 90s, and different forms of intervention, successful or otherwise, by other powers externally. And I think one of the challenges in Haiti is one of the challenges for research actually is to try to sort of understand a little bit how and whether there are any general rules to be established out of the way in which in that context, because it's relevant also in Mexico for the reasons that we've seen, also in other parts of Latin America where you have gang warfare essentially almost routinized as a part of the background social context in those countries, how does that then become escalated to a stage where it actually really begins to, threaten the entire sovereign status of that country? And I think Haiti is a worrying development in that context, but it's also a very interesting one for research to try to understand a little bit more about how that comes about, because I think it is really about understanding the broader historical context in which that conflict takes place. And for that, you're going to also have to go back a lot further in the history of Haiti to some of these previous dynamics you say that are hard to get into the data, the colonial legacy and so forth. So there's a lot going on there. But it's it's a worrying trend. Again, I think I kind of fall back on this kind of headline point of mine, which is the most important thing that we can do to respond to all of these conflicts through all the different varieties that we understand them to take shape through, is to work more on the norms and principles about which they are regulated. That used to be common sense. It now seems a very improbable thing to be suggesting, but I think it's where we need to sort of focus attention, and we have the opportunity to do so. We have a new Secretary General who's coming in at the end of this year. They will have a new mandate. We need to use this period before they come in to really ensure that figure works as hard as they can to fix some of these structural paralyses at the international and multilateral level that are really, I think, a part of the story why we see these upwelling in conflicts on the ground.
I don't know much about Haiti or Tanzania, but what we see in the countries where we work is, of course, this concerning development on what we call shrinking space for civil society, shrinking space for democracy, the cost it comes with to be an activist, to speak out about human rights violations, to speak about constitutional changes, about politicians that want to sort of argue for a third or fourth or fifth mandate. For example, in Zimbabwe these days, the president are trying to change the constitution because he realized that the party is probably more popular than he is. So it's better that the people are voting for the party and the parliament is electing the president, even though it has been a sort of a one man's vote or women's vote towards the president. We also see it in countries like South Africa, where sort of people living in informal settlements around the big cities of South Africa, around Durban, around Johannesburg, around Cape Town, are increasingly being shut down, being even killed by local authorities because they scream out for equal access to land, to resources, and so on. So this political violence you're talking about, it comes up almost every time there is an election in most of the countries where we work, and the focus should be on trying to do something on the shrinking space that these sort of democratic fighters are experiencing every day. And of course, I mentioned this earlier, this thing about how many crises can we sort of focus at the same time. We, for example, been responding on the crisis in northern Mozambique towards the border of Tanzania. At one point, it was almost 1 million IDPs. I think you could search extremely long in Norwegian newspapers to find anything about Mozambique in any of these newspapers. So it's a lot of forgotten crises and a lot of people being killed without this reaching our papers.
Yeah, well, I agree. And Tanzania and Haiti and the cases that you mentioned, I mean, those examples show why this is important, that only following the headlines won't give you much of a picture of what's going on in the world. And we have a short attention span. And I mean, that's human, but that's why we need this systematically collected data to actually pick up on all these things that are going on as well. And Tanzania is a reminder that serious organized violence can emerge in places that have been perceived as conflict-free or more peaceful. And Haiti is an interesting case in our data because it's the first time an organized crime group has stated in a political incompatibility towards the state. So we do have drug cartels fighting the Mexican army, for example, very intensely, but they have never aspired to topple the government. And the case of Haiti is actually the first time this happens in our data, which is interesting because the organized crime groups have been much left to criminology to research and analyze. So this intertwining of organized crime, violence, and political conflict is something to keep an eye on, and is interesting to look at. Yeah, to sum up, I think one of the most striking findings this year is that violence increasing, and that it's increasing in very many different ways. So interstate conflicts, electoral violence in Tanzania, the organized crime, state collapse in Haiti. So we see this on a very broad level, which is striking, worrying, and interesting.
Thank you. On that happy note, we are ending the panel discussion, but we're opening up for some Q&A if people have questions. And I think Maria will give you a microphone.
Svein Flote, an engineer with a keen interest in developing countries for 50 years. I think it's a really important report, and also the timing is really important, with a focus now on more war than peace. And I think also that it's important, one reason why the climate case is winning over you is that they're focusing on the cause and effect. I think that's really important. One thing is to count the hurricanes, a number of deaths related to hurricanes like they do there. Or try to find the key driver and the key cause. Climate change is increased CO2 content and man-made emissions. When it comes especially to the 17 African countries, which are part of this, unfortunately, for the nth year in a row, I think the main driver is population growth, strong population growth. I think the main root cause is lack of freedom for adolescent girls on 3 parameters: education, reproductive health, and early marriage. And if a country only looks at one of those, like education, like Afghanistan, that's not enough. You have to fulfill all the 3 criteria to make this girl safe, sound, and the subsequent long term, it takes some time, but in 10, 15 years, that country stands a real chance of development. If you omit that, it will be like climate change. If you omit man-made emissions, you will still have problems with hurricanes in Florida.
You want to do multiple questions?
Yeah, I guess that wasn't a question or a comment. That's fine. And I absolutely agree that we need to support girls.
I don't want to be an apologist for the Duvalier family, but in Haiti, when the Duvaliers and the Toutan Makut were in power, and in Syria, when the Assad regime was in power, there was less intergroup violence. I mean, there was state-directed violence, and I'm just wondering how that pattern plays out in lots of other places, that when a strong dictatorship, cruel dictatorship falls, we see the competing powers that arise engaging in interstate conflict.
Any of you feel you can answer that, Teresa?
Well, this is a pattern that is supported by research, right? So the most stable countries are strong democracies or strong autocracies, and the change is the dangerous thing, because that will remove the strong control and open up for ethnic tensions, intergroup rivalries, power struggles, etc. So that's something that we see in many countries. And also, if you look at the sub-country level, so going back to the drug cartels, for example, or organized crime groups, when you arrest a leader, that usually leads to more violence, right? Because there's a power vacuum that needs to be filled. So there will be power struggles within that group to fill that position.
Just one observation or comment about your coding. You said that we have to understand the coding to understand the conflict. I mean, not the other way around. I mean, isn't that important that your coding actually reflects the reality, not necessarily the reality to reflect the coding, like the question of Israel that we have been talking about, considering the Israeli-Lebanese conflict as an Israeli conflict. I think it creates lots of issues. So I think we need to look at, how actually, coding has to sort of somehow be flexible enough to understand these realities of the world. The other question is, there was briefly mentioned about the question of Rwanda. And what's interesting about the Rwanda-Congo conflict is that it is the competition for resources, mineral resources, as well as regional autonomy or sort of regional leadership. So because we West have been sort of very soft on Rwanda after what has happened, we are also unwilling to understand what Rwanda is doing in Congo. So I think it's important that will you consider it an interstate conflict, or would you consider it as an internal conflict supported by external power? How do you sort of define this?
So first of all, with the coding rules, of course, we want to represent what's going on in the world. But if we would change the definitions and the coding rules when the world changes, the comparability would be lost. So Palestine is not the first territory that aspires to be an independent state. And if we would change the coding rules for if we would say, okay, let's just consider this a sovereign state because that's how people perceive it, that would create other problems with like the former Yugoslavian countries, for example. So applying these definitions strictly means that we can compare across time and space. So that's really important to us. But then, of course, if we see a lot of violence that won't fit into these categories, we also need to adjust like we have. So we added the non-state and one-sided categories in the early 2000s just to show that there is also other things going on where the state is not necessarily not only intrastate and interstate war, but there could be conflicts between other groups where the state is not involved. And adding this violent political protest category is also a way of adjusting to a world where we see a type of violence becoming increasingly that we see more frequently, but that is not captured by the data. But our definitions are very sort of strictly applied across time and space to ensure the comparability. And when it comes to Rwanda and the DRC, we have several conflicts going on at the same time, but we go by the statements by the warring parties and the incompatibility. So what we do in the DRC, for example, is coding it as an internationalized intrastate conflict where Rwanda is supporting the M23 alliance against DR Congo. We have also had the FDLR conflict where they are speaking about the regime in Rwanda, but are being supported by Congo. Sometimes also Congo fights them sometimes because they sign these agreements with Rwanda every now and then that they're going to fight each other's rebel groups. So it's a lot to consider in that region, but both of those are coded as intrastate, internationalized intrastate conflicts. And it has to do with the stated incompatibility by the parties themselves.
Thank you, Wenka Hauge from PRIO. I just have one question about all the events in the Caribbean where the US has bombed several boats. And I think now the number of deaths are, it's at least over 100, I think. Is there any way in your data set that you capture this kind of violence? Because Trump and the U.S. administration, of course, uses the excuse of drugs, but there are also proofs that many of these are just civilian fishermen. Thank you.
Yeah, so this is one of the types of violence that sometimes falls out of the data because of the stated intention being targeting these drug gangs, which are usually organized armed actors, but they don't have a political incompatibility. They're not seeking to overthrow the government in the US or in any other country. If we can, by investigations or testimonies from others, like if we can determine that the US knew that they're attacking only civilians, that could end up in the one-sided violence data. But if they're saying that they're attacking an armed actor, that means it won't be picked up by our categories of violence, unfortunately. So this is another sort of category that we might need to add in the future.
Thank you. I'm Jürgen Jenshagen from PRIO. I very much appreciate and understand like the difficulties of these definitions and the need to keep them the same over time. My question kind of is to how kind of one data set occurs within, let's say, a landscape of data sets. So what I'm thinking about is your explanation for coding, Israel, Palestinians as an internal conflict. And in one way, I completely understand that, right? Because Israel is the de facto sovereign. There is a de facto process of annexation. There is no sovereign, independent Palestinian state. But the implications of that is also then that Israel cannot be a democracy, right? Because if that is a civil war, basically it means that 50% of the population is under Israeli control without having any rights, right? So within other data sets, within kind of the same landscape that you're working in, it is coded as a democracy, and therefore the occupation is an external thing. So I'm just curious as to how you relate to kind of this landscape of data set debates.
When we entered into the DemScore network a few years ago, that's a network combining, for example, varieties of democracy data, quality of governance data with UCDP data. One of the hardest things was to actually determine what's a country. Like, we thought it would be easy to just merge the data sets on country level, but we did not agree on what a country is. Palestine is not the only case. Somaliland, we have others like similar cases that we disagree on if they're seen as countries or sovereign states or not. We have decided to go with the Gleditsch Ward definition of a state to make it consistent. And of course, that's something, if you're merging data sets or working with other data sets, that's something that needs to be taken into consideration. But again, just because it's problematic to merge the data set is not a reason for us to change the definitions, because that would create a lot of other problems.
Hello, my name is Diana and I am from Palestine. Of course, it hurts a lot when I come here and I hear that it's very difficult to describe what's happening in Palestine because it has been streamed on TV, on social media, and we have been seeing exactly what's happening in Palestine. So before we would say, you have to come to Palestine in order to understand the situation. But I think that now, in these recent times, we have enough materials to understand enough what's happening there. So to find it very difficult to describe it and put the right terms to how things are going there, and to deny that there's an actual genocide that is happening until this very moment that we are speaking. And there have been children, families, women and men that have been erased completely from earth. And if we want to define what is genocide, it is a deliberate, systematic destruction of a group, a race, or a member of a society, and that's what Israel has been doing exactly. Or I can't find any other definition for what Israel has been doing, not just in Gaza, but also in the West Bank, because in the West Bank it's also a very silent genocide that is happening there. And if you have looked at the news recently, where we see a 7-month-old baby that has been killed in the West Bank while his family was driving near Hebron, and the baby was killed while he was held in the hands in his mother's arms. So I think it's not right to say that the situation is complicated. I think it's clear as crystal, but the world is very scared of Israel, and everyone is scared of Israel. That's why it's been very difficult to hold Israel accountable, and that's why the world has been failing Palestinians, because they are scared of Israel, and everyone is scared, whether it's the Western world, whether it's international institutions. And I think if we don't put the right words, we will keep failing in decreasing the violence, or actually finding a real solution where we can stop the violence in Palestine, because we all know what is the real problem, and if we can't say it, then we will never be able to actually fix it. And when we say that Palestine is not a country, of course that is not true, because Palestine has been always a country. It has always existed, even before the creation of the State of Israel. Palestine and Palestinians lived there for long, long decades. And we have a very strong culture, we have a strong identity, we have history, we have institutions. And yes, we are having challenges and difficulties to have sovereignty, because we are under occupation, but that doesn't make us less of a country just because we are under occupation. We have declared our independence in 1988, and we have been recognized by many states, and we are a member of the United Nations, and more than 150 countries have recognized Palestine. So if we want to discuss which one is the country, because in order to be a country, you have to have very clear borders. And if I ask you what are the borders of Israel, I am very sure you would not exactly know what are the borders, because as we see on the screen, we see that there's a conflict between Israel and Syria, and Israel has invaded Syria and the Golan Heights. Israel considers it as part of its borders, and we actually don't know what are the borders of Israel, because it wants to keep expanding, and that's why we have a conflict. I would not call it a conflict, but we have, let's say, an occupation of southern Lebanon, and that is because Israel doesn't respect international law, doesn't respect international borders, and Lebanon is recognized as a full sovereign country, while Israel can't respect that because they keep invading southern Lebanon, bombing it, and we can't actually see where Israel is going to have its own borders. Where is the limit? So if we want to actually say that Palestine is not a country and Israel is the country, I think we should look back again and actually think more about that. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so first of all, we don't have a category where we define genocide. So that's not a term that we use and define and categorize in the data. So we do have one-sided violence against civilians, we have state-based conflicts and non-state conflicts and so on. So we don't have, we don't use that or define that. That's another sort of like the international humanitarian law definition of genocide. So this is more of like how we classify what's going on. the situation is complex, of course, but I mean, we do have very good data from Gaza and the West Bank as well, showing that a lot of civilians are being killed, and for targeting one member of a militant group, and maybe like 30 or 100 civilians are being killed in the same strike. So we obviously see in the data that Israel does not care about the civilians being killed while targeting the militant groups. That's very clear from our data, like the disaggregated data. When it comes to Palestine as a state, like I said, the Gladitian War does not define it as such. It's not our definition, but I think it has to do with the de facto territorial control is lacking, and in spite of it being internationally recognized by many countries, including Sweden. And I can just emphasize that we are, like the UCDP, we're not making judgment in any case in the world. So we're trying to be as objective as possible, describing things based on the definitions and not judging what's going on. Although, I mean, of course, I can also see what's going on in Gaza as a person, but when UCDP data is concerned, we have this very strict definitions to define the violence that we see in the world, to be able to compare it across time and space.
Thank you. I think we've come to an end now. Thank you all for coming. Bring a copy of the report if you'd like. If not, it's online. Thank you.